human rights and freedom of expression. He studied philosophy at University College London, and he's written for the New Humanist, New Statesman, Prospect Magazine, and Comment is Free. His first book, Titanic Express, recounts his search for the truth about the death of his sister. And he's also written a book entitled Don't Get Fooled Again, The Skeptic's Guide for Life. Now, before I'm going to let him talk, I do have a question for him. Richard, can you help us out? We've actually got... The other one, okay. We can have that one.
Okay.
Yeah, I just have a question for you, Richard, because there's a danger of Dorset Humanists splitting in two over a very important question. And the question is the spelling of the word skepticism. Now, I'm hoping that, you've written a book about skepticism, so I want you to try and help us with this dilemma. Now, are you a seaman or a caveman?
A few years ago, I started out as a seaman, but since that time I've gone on a bit of a journey. I've been so inspired by the growth of skeptics in the pub that I feel a duty of respect to them to sometimes spell it with a K and sometimes I still spell it with a C. So I'm sitting on the C and K fence.
Okay, so that should please everyone. Well, look, will you give a please a warm welcome to Richard Wilson.
Good afternoon, thank you very much for that introduction and starting me off with a particularly challenging question. Yes, a few years ago I got the opportunity to write what was modestly billed as a Skeptic's Guide to Life. And it was an absolutely fascinating task because effectively I was able to write about whatever seemed interesting, but with a skeptical framework, and obviously I'd studied philosophy. So that was kind of my starting point. And really I looked at I really tried to work through the principles of skepticism by looking at a whole series of particular issues so that we're tying it to something in real life. So I looked at some of the conspiracy theories around 9/11, I looked at some of the jiggery-pokery around the science of the cigarette industry tried to engage in when it first became clear that cigarettes were causing cancer. I looked at the alternative medicine industry, which has been kind of well scrutinised in the last few years, thankfully. But the topic that I particularly focused on in that respect was looking at the people who deny that HIV causes AIDS, and that was a big focus of the book. And then lastly, I started to get into this idea of bogus skeptics, and I looked at some of the things that are sometimes referred to as denialism, in particular Holocaust denial, as it's sometimes called, and the writing of David Irving. So it was a very wide-ranging book. But as I was writing it, it was really the bogus skepticism issue that really started to seem like the big one for me in terms of what I was going to focus on. But before I go any further, if you'll indulge me, I'd just like to share some of the comments that I've had in response to the book. This first one is from somebody who didn't give his second name, just called himself Michael, and Michael says, "Come out of your little eggshell and wake up and smell the coffee. You will find that there is no proof that HIV is the cause of AIDS." And that was Michael's contribution. And then I also had a response from somebody who calls himself Bernie in Oz. And Bernie in Oz says, "In 1,000 years from now, David Irving's books on the insane fratricidal European war will still be read by scholars, while pathetic scribblers like you are forgotten shadows and dust." Which is actually, I think, my favourite thing that anyone has said about what I've done. So that maybe gives you a flavour of the kind of issues that I've touched on, and really that some of the issues that you can look at from a skeptic perspective are issues that people, to put it mildly, feel very strongly about. But what was really striking, as I mentioned, as I was exploring the issues I was writing about, was that a lot of the more odd and potentially dangerous ideas that I was discovering that people were putting forward, whether that was a conspiracy theory or a piece of medical quackery or as we looked at Holocaust denial, that people were putting those ideas forward by co-opting the language of rational inquiry. They were presenting themselves as skeptics and using the language of skepticism to advance what seemed to be some pretty questionable ideas. So obviously there are people who say that they're skeptical about the events of 9/11, September 11th attacks. The same people who will claim that the whole thing was faked using holographic laser projections. But they're calling themselves skeptics. And there are people who will establish or adopt the mantle of skepticism to attack whole areas of medical science, and given that medical science is, by definition, pretty much a life or death issue, that's also got quite a serious implication, I think. So, as I mentioned earlier, the case that I really looked into was the people who describe themselves as skeptics about the science and the medicine of HIV and AIDS. And for reasons that I hope will become clear, I'm going to suggest that the self-described AIDS skeptics are not just bogus in their skepticism, but that if you want to find a real paradigm case of the bogus skeptic phenomenon, as I call it, in its most lurid form, then AIDS skepticism, or so-called AIDS skepticism, is possibly the standout example. So I'm going to talk about the AIDS skeptics a bit, and then I'm going to look at how the story of AIDS skepticism can illuminate the wider problem of bogus skepticism as a kind of rhetorical device that people use for misleading people. And then finally I'm going to start to look at the particular warning signs that we can look for to help distinguish what I would suggest is bogus skepticism from the genuine variety. And then finally I'm going to end with a controversial suggestion and a question. Before I go any further, can I just check that everyone can hear what I'm saying? Is anyone who can't hear? Am I holding the mic in the appropriate way? Real good, okay. So anyway, the story of the AIDS skeptics. I'm sure that some of you will remember, as I do, that terrifying time in the early 1980s when this new disease had appeared that was claiming thousands of lives. Very little understanding of how and why, but it seemed to be growing very quickly. It was first really, I think, identified in 1981 in the US when doctors suddenly noticed a massive increase of deaths from pneumonia among otherwise healthy, relatively young, fit people. And there was no known cause and there was no known cure. But by 1983, it had actually been fairly well established that the cause of this disease was a virus which was named HIV. Took a long time to do anything about it, but the cause was identified quite early. But even at that stage, there were people who were unwilling to accept the science, that weren't convinced by it, and were coming up with all sorts of theories and explanations which now seem quite strange. So in 1984, there was a psychologist called Caspar Schmidt who wrote an article that you will still find being quoted online now by the so-called AIDS skeptics. And Caspar Schmidt claimed that AIDS was caused not by a virus, but by a self-hating group fantasy among gay men and drug addicts. And he connected the appearance of this horrible disease with the election of President Reagan. And he claimed as well that this was all, that America had seen a vast society-wide conservative swing, and that this would cause an epidemic of shame-induced depression. And it was this, he said, that was causing this horrible, immune collapse that was seen in AIDS patients. So even by the standards of the time, it seemed like a pretty wild hypothesis. But what's really striking is that you'll still find people making similar arguments today, after everything that we now know. And strikingly, and this is a theme that I think emerges more and more when you start to look at what the AIDS skeptics have been up to. In 1984, Caspar Schmidt himself, the man that claimed that AIDS was a result of proof fantasy, died of an AIDS-related illness. And one of the most sort of striking features of the story is the number of very public, high-profile so-called AIDS skeptics who then go on to die from the disease. So that was the early days, but even as the evidence around HIV and AIDS grew, and even as the science became more robust and the gaps in the explanation of what was happening began to be filled, there were people who continued to dismiss that evidence. And the most prominent of the AIDS skeptics is a virologist called Peter Duesberg. And he's an intriguing figure because he's not just a crank working in his garden shed. He's a real scientist who has tenure at the University of Berkeley. And he does do real research. But the other striking thing is that the research that he does himself is not on HIV and AIDS. So he's an example of a scientist who has qualifications and has expertise, but then goes on to critique another area of science in which he's not such an expert. And the work that he does is not based on his own, it's not his own research. It's not like he's in a laboratory doing tests on HIV and AIDS. It's very much critiquing other people's work and basically picking holes in other people's work and objecting to technicalities in papers. And it's all a bit of a mystery about why he takes this approach. But part of the explanation for this is that he is an expert in a certain kind of viruses called retroviruses. And HIV is a kind of retrovirus, so there is a connection to his work. But Duesberg's big theory for a long time was that retroviruses, this subcategory of viruses, could never harm their host. They were harmless. And then obviously a virus comes along which patently is harming people. Rather than reappraise the theory that this is a harmless category of virus, he's done everything he can to dismiss the evidence, even as it's continued to pile up. And in doing so, he's had to come up with his own explanation. So he's suggested, he hasn't done the research, but he's suggested that AIDS may be caused by recreational drug use. Again, early days, maybe not that plausible, given that drug addicts were among the groups of people getting the disease, but simply doesn't really add up when you start to look at the data. But the most striking and clearly, I think, the most dangerous suggestion that Duesberg has made is that AIDS may in fact be caused by the medicines used by doctors to treat people with HIV. So Duesberg has suggested it's the medicines that people are giving that are causing the symptoms associated with AIDS. And needless to say, he's not been able to produce any research or any actual data or evidence to prove this hypothesis. And he's, on this issue, he has struggled to get those arguments published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, exactly for those reasons. And his ideas have not been accepted by established AIDS experts, and indeed a lot of people, particularly at the time when he was most prominent, which was a few years ago, were very concerned about what he was saying because of the risks of spreading that kind of story. But even though his ideas have been rejected by the scientific establishment, Duesberg has been very successful in persuading the mainstream media to give him a platform. And he's been doing that both in the UK and in the US. And in the US, there's a journalist, a very vocal journalist who remains very convinced on this to this day, who's throughout the 1990s was claiming that Duesberg was being silenced by this medical establishment that didn't want to hear what he had to say, and suggested that there was a deathly conspiracy of silence to keep his ideas sidelined. And in the UK, Duesberg's views have been championed by the Sunday Times, certainly were in the 1990s. The Sunday Times medical correspondent, a man called Neville Hodgkinson, similarly taken with Duesberg's ideas and was claiming that the scientific and medical professions had been gripped by a kind of collective insanity in their belief that AIDS and HIV were connected. So Duesberg was quite successfully characterised as the kind of heroic iconoclast, a Galileo-like figure, standing up to this cruel and dogmatic scientific establishment in their repressive belief that HIV was the cause of AIDS. And strikingly, I mean, in researching this book, I had to read a lot of this stuff, and it's well written, it's compelling, it's clear. It's wrong, but it's really, really rhetorically well put together. And you can start, when you start to read it, you can start to see how somebody who might not be a scientific expert themselves could be taken in by it. And people have been taken in, and there's a grim list of people who have actually been persuaded to stop taking medicines that could have saved their lives, who've gone on to die from the disease. And each of those is obviously an individual tragedy. In most of the world, the impact of these ideas has been largely limited to those individuals. It's even been going on in the last few years as well. There have been high-profile people. There were people that responded to my book in 2008 who have died since the book was written from AIDS, who modern medicine could have saved. So it's a kind of ongoing horror, really. But tragic though those individual cases are, there is one country in the world where what I call bogus skepticism around HIV and AIDS has wreaked havoc on a far, far larger and deadlier scale. And that country is South Africa. Some of you may have heard something around the last president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, the man who succeeded Nelson Mandela, one of the most prominent politicians in one of the most prominent countries in Africa. And for a period of around 5 years, from 2000 to 2005, AIDS skepticism was effectively South African government policy. And the way it started was, bizarrely, in 1999, President Thabo Mbeki personally became quite fascinated by the AIDS skeptics' ideas, and this was in the context of AIDS being on the rise in South Africa. There were issues around the cost of the medicines that had to be provided to save people's lives, and they were facing many challenges as a country. And in seeking to educate himself, Thabo Mbeki came across the ideas of the so-called AIDS skeptics, apparently on the internet, and apparently he spent a lot of time reading these very lurid, very persuasive websites. And he became convinced that there was a problem with HIV and AIDS science. And he actually went so far as to invite a group of the most prominent so-called AIDS skeptics in the world, including Peter Duesberg, to come to South Africa and advise him on what his health policy should be. And one of the things that they advised him to do was to halt the use of antiretroviral drugs, to stop giving out to the public the main group of medicines that scientists and doctors would use to treat HIV. And as you may imagine, the policy was a disaster. AIDS deaths skyrocketed, life expectancy plummeted, and people didn't take this lying down. There were campaigns, there were court cases, there was a series of court battles by groups representing AIDS patients that basically took the government to court to make them distribute these medicines. And finally, they won the case in 2004 when the government at last started to supply medicines that had been withholding for nearly 5 years. But obviously that's a long period of time for someone suffering from HIV in a poor township in Johannesburg. And one study by Harvard University has estimated that this single decision, South African government's decision to withhold life-saving medicines from its own population, which was on the basis of this bogus skeptic ideology, this decision led to over 330,000 preventable deaths. So we're not just talking about an academic discussion here, we're not just talking about dancing on pinheads about an abstract discussion. This is absolutely life and death issue. For me, this is one of the clearest examples of where a failure to apply skepticism in the right way, kind of wrong-headed, bogus skepticism, can have absolutely critical life or death impacts. Just by way of comparison, that number, 330,000, easily exceeds the number of people killed in all of the brutal wars that took place in the former Yugoslavia during the 1990s. And it was an entirely preventable disaster. It was simply the basis of a government decision based on bad advice. Now, happily, the South African government has now changed its approach, and survival rates are much better, and that immediate problem hopefully isn't going to arise again. And globally, partly because of the South African case, so-called bogus skepticism around AIDS appears to be in decline. There is, as you may imagine, a devoted band of followers of Duisburg who are probably never going to change their minds about this, and they keep on going, they keep on having their conferences, and they keep on publishing things on the website. But they also keep dying, and the kind of brutal fact of it is that the way it looks is that this is a movement that will probably eventually burn itself out. But for me, the very fact that it's such an extreme case means that there are some important lessons that we can draw about what bogus skepticism is and how it works and how you can spot it. So just to sort of work that through, I wanted to sort of take a look at what the sort of key features are of genuine skepticism. And I was wondering, does anyone want to help me out? What's the single most important feature of a skeptic?
Always ask for evidence.
Absolutely, I always ask for evidence. So there's the skeptics form their beliefs on the basis of evidence and the best available evidence, I suggest as well. Any other contributions on what genuine skeptics do? Mistrust. That's true. Questioning and critiquing, and not just taking any old evidence. You've got to take the decent evidence, you've got to put it to the test. And one of the things I've noted now is that and skeptics don't just cherry pick the evidence. You don't just take the evidence that suits you and supports your preconceived ideas, but you also you're prepared to change your ideas. You don't come with a preformed conclusion. You try to adapt your conclusion around the evidence. Any other
motive?
Motive. What kind of motive?
If of course the speaker presenting the evidence comes from the tobacco company,
yes,
treated accordingly. If, however, he comes from a devoted humanist, treated accordingly.
So looking at the credentials in the background. Okay, I agree with that. And of course, with the skeptics, very often the people presenting those ideas were people who, for one reason or another, had some kind of stake in it that was to some extent self-interested. Well, those are some of the things. I mean, the other point I wanted to highlight, and this is a difficult one for all of us sometimes at the best of times, but it's a quality sometimes called intellectual humility. So, these are my beliefs, this is what I think the evidence shows, but I might be wrong. I might have missed something. I know that I have biases and prejudices that can affect my judgment and lead me astray. So I would suggest also that a genuine skeptic is someone who's open to changing their beliefs if new evidence or a better argument comes along. And what I'm going to suggest is that one of the defining features of bogus skepticism is, which is often the giveaway, it's a double standard in the way that they think about evidence. So the bogus skeptic will set a very, very high bar before they accept, or they'll accept an impossibly high bar to test the theory that they are rejecting, but at the same time they'll accept a much lower standard of proof for the alternative view that they're actually putting forward. So, for example, the AIDS skeptics, people like Peter Duesberg, would look at an enormous epidemiological study on AIDS with a great deal of evidence behind it, and it might have been based on thousands and thousands of cases, and they'll pick on one small methodological weakness and use that to reject the whole study. Or for a long time, very much like the evolution skeptics do, the AIDS skeptics would point out the bits of the HIV theory that haven't yet been filled in, and even if overall the picture was clear, based on that small detail they would say, well, the case is not proven. Yet at the same time, the AIDS skeptics will go around claiming, on the basis of really no evidence at all, that certain drugs like AZT are responsible for the massive immune damage that you see in people with AIDS, and they'll come up with all these theories like stress causing AIDS or epidemic hysteria causing AIDS, which don't have any evidence around them at all. So there's a complete double standard in the way that they talk about the evidence. So for me, this is one way in which we can see how the bogus skeptics around AIDS have elements in common with a whole range of other dangerous characters who use skepticism or a mantle of skepticism to advance their ideas. There are some striking parallels that I look at in the book between the rhetorical tactics used by the AIDS skeptics and the approach used by tobacco industry funded scientists in the 1960s, who continued to claim that the link between smoking and cancer was unproven long after actually the industry themselves were admitting internally that the link was real. There's also very clearly a parallel with people who claim to be sceptical about the Holocaust. The so-called historian David Irving, who's one of whose fans I quoted earlier in my talk, he has tried to argue at one point that an amateur forensic test done sort of sneakily by someone who went to the gas chambers in Auschwitz, this test proves conclusively that the gas chambers could not be used to exterminate people on the basis that this person didn't find as much cyanide as 50 years later as they would have been expecting. So that's a pretty flimsy argument, I would suggest. But at the same time, David Irving will set an extraordinarily high level of proof that he demands to accept before he accepts the overwhelming evidence that the Nazis were indeed deliberately plotting genocide. So I would suggest that this leads on to something else, which is one of the real features of bogus skepticism, which is that while the bogus skeptic may present themselves as an open-minded skeptic, and they may present themselves as someone who's merely questioning the established orthodoxy, a lot of the time when you dig a bit deeper, what you find is what they're really doing is engaging in a no-holds-barred defence of a fixed ideological position that they aren't necessarily revealing. So, Duesberg believes a certain thing about retroviruses being harmless. No one else agrees, but instead of just putting that idea forward and trying to argue it on its own merits, he tries to attack the alternative view as a means of advancing his own ideas. And tragically, of course, for many people who were drawn to AIDS skepticism, it was a very comforting idea to believe, particularly in the early days when the treatments were not very effective. It was quite comforting to believe that actually this was all a myth, it was all a lie, it was a big conspiracy, this was a non-existent virus and they weren't really sick and they weren't really going to die. So motive is absolutely critical, and often with the bogus skeptics you start to find out when you dig a bit deeper. And of course the case of David Irving, as was shown in a subsequent court case, definitively proven he was a big fan of the Nazis, and that was really what his ideological position was that he was advancing. And a further sort of sign that we can look for is that if you're a bogus skeptic and you're having to claim that an entire section of modern science or an entire section of academic knowledge is totally wrong, then you're going to need some kind of explanation of how it is that so many scientists have got it wrong. So often what you find with bogus skeptics is some kind of conspiracy theory, and it might be that they claim that the scientific establishment has gone bad, they've been corrupted, the scientists are all in it, they're doing it for the money, they're doing it for the research grants, they're doing it because Big Pharma has paid them, or it might be the other approach might be to suggest that the scientific community has gone mad, that they're gripped by collective insanity or alarmism or hysteria. And when you look at the sorts of things that the skeptics and others say, these sorts of arguments start to come back again and again, because ultimately they have to find a way of debunking the credibility of established science if they're going to put their own ideas forward. And then one final detail that I would highlight is that bogus skepticism often thrives where there's a long time gap between cause and effect. This was very much the case with smoking and cancer in the 1960s. The fact is that cancer in smokers can be caused by exposure to cigarette smoke decades before the disease manifests itself. And that made it much harder to prove the link between the two definitively. Obviously the same is true with HIV and AIDS. If it was the case that you caught HIV 1 month and then you died the next, it would be much harder to create confusion and doubt about the link. So now I'm going to come to my controversial suggestion, and it's about a group of people who actually got mentioned a bit earlier, a group of people who call themselves skeptics, and who I actually, for various reasons, assiduously avoided talking about in my book, by and large. And my suggestion is that there are some striking parallels between the AIDS skeptics and people who describe themselves as skeptics about climate change science. The first parallel I would suggest is that the people who deny the link between climate change and carbon dioxide certainly are increasingly against the grain of the established science. And as I sort of suggested earlier, because they are against the overwhelming consensus, some people will dispute that, but I mean, it appears to be quite a clear consensus. They then have to find ways of explaining that consensus away. And one of the approaches that we see is to suggest that the climate scientists are up to no good, that they've been corrupted, and climate science is also often dismissed as a product of hysteria or alarmism. And I'd also suggest that in many ways so-called climate change skepticism is a very comforting idea. Just as it was comforting in the early days of HIV and AIDS to suggest that the disease wasn't real. Personally, I really hope that the climate skeptics are right, and that the climate scientists are wrong, and that the prognosis isn't as bad as the science appears to suggest. But if I'm honest, I strongly suggest it's the other way around, or strongly suspect it's the other way around. And my controversial suggestion, which I'm sure we can debate shortly, is that when it comes to bogus skepticism, this is the biggie, this is the big one. However big the damage that the AIDS and HIV skeptics have done, if some of the predictions that respected scientists have made about climate change are correct, the potential for damage is perhaps even bigger. And I know that that's not a hopeful conclusion, but skeptics and humanists are supposed to stare difficult truths in the face, and if I'm honest, it's hard to find a much more difficult truth than this one. So the question I want to finish on is this: if the climate scientists are right, and if climate change skepticism really is a form of bogus skepticism, what, if anything, should skeptics and humanists be doing about it? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for leading us to that stimulating question. So, the rules of engagement are you can't speak without the microphone. When I give it to you, just hold it steady. Don't wave it around like this, because then we won't hear you. I think those are the only rules. So, who wants to go first? I thought maybe Ken might come in first. So, we'll come over to Ken.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, can you hear me?
No.
Hello, am I on? Is the second mic working? Dave? You can hear me?
No.
No?
No.
Shall we try? Shall I try with the other one, Dave? Let's just. Oh, that's okay. Okay, right.
Speak up, speak up.
Talk right into it. Shut up.
On any subject, and particularly on climate change, I think it's very important to have a debate, and both sides of the debate seem to be anxious to suppress the views of the other side. What amazed me, and hasn't been widely published, is that after the Kyoto Treaty, which was based on a paper initially put together by scientists and then mulled around a bit by politicians, not many people know that 17,000 scientists signed a telegram protesting about the science in this particular paper. And there certainly is a big problem on this subject of trying to find out what actually is the truth. And I agree with what you say, that you've got to look at the science, you've got to look at all the evidence. And it's not, no one side has a God-given right to their views. I've got that much to say. I think there are a lot of questions that the skeptics need to have answered before we can agree on one side or the other.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that no one side has a God-given right to their views, and it's very unfair. And I think one of the problems is I'm not a scientist on climate change myself. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an AIDS expert. And with science being as it is, to some extent, we're left having to, at a certain point, decide who we can trust and who we can't trust. As an expert, every time we go on a plane, we're trusting that the pilot is an expert in flying the plane, and we're trusting him with our life. When we go to a doctor and get treatment, again, we're trusting them with our lives. And the basic question is, how do you distinguish a real, genuine expert from the bogus variety? And I've tried to suggest some things that we can look for in the way that people talk about science and in terms of HIV and AIDS, because the same questions that we might ask about climate scientists, people have and do ask about doctors and AIDS scientists, and I think it's a really difficult question. But my personal response is that if the science is sound, and if the methods that are being used by climate scientists are sound, and if it's true, and I know there is some dispute about the extent of the consensus, but if it's true that the consensus among scientists on climate change who know their stuff points to a certain thing, then I feel I'm not in a position to do anything differently than I would if I went to my doctor and they prescribed me medicine for a health condition. I think for me, I look at it the same way, and I appreciate there's a debate about how you then respond. But that's my take. One other thing I would say is actually there are, with the AIDS skeptics, there was a letter that was circulated that had thousands of signatures from people, including people with Nobel Prizes, demanding that the established science on HIV/AIDS be reappraised, and that's something that you actually see as well. So it is a rhetorical minefield, and I guess my own conclusions really, I follow the same approach I would when I go to the doctor. If there was evidence that there had been a conspiracy, sometimes conspiracies happen. It might be that, it's theoretically possible that the science has been corrupted by a conspiracy, but I haven't seen any evidence of that myself.
I'll let you respond briefly to that, Kerry, but then I must pass it on to other people. Thanks very much.
There are a lot of unanswered questions, and I think you really need to read my book on the subject. Probably in the library.
Okay, cool.
The bit that concerns me regarding the climate change argument is that the emphasis that's being put on the fact that it's us changing it, and therefore most people sort of think, how can we possibly be changing the whole environment of the world? But there's no doubt about it that the climate is changing, and we are not helping it. We're exacerbating the situation. But the climate has been changing for billions of years and will carry on changing for billions of years. But that doesn't mean that if we're exacerbating the situation, we shouldn't try to take some action to retard that. But the way it's presented, I think it doesn't carry the argument very well, in as much as they're trying to make it, oh, well, it's us humans that are doing it. It's our fault that it's changing. It isn't our fault it's changing, but it's our fault it's changing quickly.
I think I agree with you, and I think there is a concern for humanists, which I've heard expressed in the way that some elements of the environmental movement talk about humans as a kind of infestation or a disease, and that's actually anti-humanist. And I think that's very unfortunate. I agree with it. I don't think it helps at all. Because for me, I'm mostly, I do care about the polar bears, but mostly I'm thinking about, I've got 2 small children, but they're going to, hopefully one day they'll have children. I want the world that they live in to be, I want the civilization that we have now to carry on. But the thing that concerns me the most is exactly the effect on humans of what's been predicted, rather than coming up with a sort of list of who's to blame and feeling bad about it. For me, it's about solving a practical problem, if there's any way of doing it.
Just hold it close.
Yes. I wonder, please, whether you'd agree that we don't want to get involved in the merits of each particular argument here. It's the stuff behind it that matters. The subject matter of your book, Mr. Watson, actually. May I ask you, what do you think? Is it not simply a matter of critical thinking? We used to call it critical thinking. The ability to distinguish between the skeptics, who are cons, and the real debate.
I agree, it is a matter of critical thinking, but what's really striking is that I think someone can think critically and still end up in a weird place. Like the Thabo Mbeki, president of South Africa, I don't think he was a stupid man. I don't think he was a madman. He thought of himself as a critical thinker. And partly because of his pride in himself as a critical thinker, he ended up being taken in, paradoxically, by people who presented themselves as skeptics. So, for me, it's something more. It's maybe an understanding of the particular types of rhetoric that people would use to fool their audience. And some of that is, you can't just discover it from first principles. Sometimes it is helpful at least to look at what's worked for the quacks in the past. That makes sense.
Becomes a circular,
and the tricks that they use, and the very fact that I think one of the dangers that emerges from the Bogus Skeptic story is that they persuade the audience to drop their defences because they're saying, you could do the same thing. I'm presenting myself as a skeptic. I'm just asking questions, and I'm just questioning and criticising. Isn't that what you want? So that makes it harder to spot what they're doing, and really that's my sort of key conclusion.
Scientists are quite a modest lot. They don't talk about proof, they talk about support for a particular theory. And I think the three things that you've mentioned, AIDS, and climate change and smoking, are all based on correlation evidence. And the difficulty is that correlation is not causation. And so that leaves a huge opening for people to drive horse and car through. And it's been a bogus skeptic that you can drive horse and car through. Because you can never come up with proof, you can only come up with an indication. And I think that's the point about climate change, that all the indication is correlation evidence. It's looking at temperature change over the last 150 years since it's been recorded, and it's looking at the amount of CO2, methane in the atmosphere, and looking at all of those gases, and looking at the correlation between the two. If you apply other types of tests, then you can triangulate between them. That's what scientists try to do, to try to increase the body of evidence, but there's never such a thing as proof, and that's the problem. At the end of the day, if you believe that there is strong enough correlation, then you have to act accordingly, and I think that's the problem, that it's a political thing then.
Yeah, I think I agree on that, and that's where I think what we've got a sort of perfect storm of factors with climate change, that it's like smoking and cancer in that it's a correlation. Well, it's more difficult, but it's in that same area. I agree with you that you're looking at indications rather than direct cause and effect. I'm driving my car tomorrow, there's a hurricane on Thursday. If it was like that, I think it would be much easier to get consensus to deal with it. And I guess the problem is, maybe there would never be proof, but by the time I think the political problem is, by the time it becomes so clear and so overwhelming that there is this link, it might actually be too late to do anything about it. Sometimes compare it to, you're on the Titanic, you're heading towards the iceberg, the person reading the radar says, well, Captain, I think there's a big iceberg, we've got to change direction. The captain's saying, well, are you absolutely sure? Would you go and have a look at the instruments again? Can we have some other people come and look at the instruments? Bang! But it's not even that simple, because you hit the iceberg, but you don't sink for another 100 years. At that point, it's too late, because you've got to the iceberg 100 years ago. So I think it's an unprecedented problem, of unprecedented scale, and it's the greatest, probably, if it is as appears to be the case from the science, it's probably one of the greatest logistical problems that human species has ever faced. Which again is why I suggested it should be something, it's appropriate for skeptics and humanists to be talking about it.
I'm very concerned about skepticism with the BBC, because they've hardly performed any science for more than a year, and the consequence is, according to my neighbour, contrary to my neighbour, the scientists did explain what they'd achieved and what they understood. But now there's hardly